Hey everyone, so today's video is going to start a two-part series talking about theories surrounding cognitive development. And it's really going to focus on one of two theorists. Today's video is going to focus on Piaget or Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist who came up with the theory of cognitive development that we talk about today. So in studying cognitive development from earlier in the course, we really looked at the fact that our behaviors and thoughts are influenced by mental representations. And these can form through our processing information into our own individualized pictures of understanding. As we grow and mature, though, the quality and the depth of these mental process representations change and they become much more sophisticated than they were when we were younger. And there's really little debate within the psychological community that the strength of the mental representations change and become more sophisticated. But psychologists do debate the following. So the first is that what are the changes in mental representations? In what ways do they change? Do the changes take place suddenly or do they take place gradually? Meaning, can you just one day suddenly do things you weren't able to do the day before, or is it a slow process? What causes the changes to occur? Is this something biological? Is this something cognitive? Is this something within our environment that changes? And then how do these changes really affect human behavior? And so studies of human cognitive development become of great value to education and criminology. And education may be a little bit easier to process than criminality, but when we think about the courtroom, we think about the age and mental development of who is being accused, who is the suspect in this case, and the degree to which they can understand and be held responsible for the crime that they are committing. So that leads us into Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So Jean Piaget was a psychologist in the mid 20th century. A lot of his research took place between the 30s and like the 60s and 70s. And he believed that the physical process of personal mental development enables learning to take place. So again, it's much more biologically grounded because what he is saying is that the biological structures must be in place first before this growth in learning and this growth in cognitive development can take place. And Piaget, saw cognitive development as a form of adaptation. Two basic processes are acting on each other. The first is assimilation. And this is where we change one's behavior or perception of the world to better fit into already existing schemas. So you could fill up a container with liquid, and that would be assimilation. But in accommodation, we change one's schemas to better fit the world. And so we, instead of just filling up the container that we have, we change out the container altogether to fit more liquid. And so those are the two processes through which cognitive development acts on each other. There were a few other essential ideas to come out of Piaget's work, and his work was extremely important in understanding the idea that children, in fact, do think differently than adults. They aren't just small adults who are going to be taught. They really actually do think differently. So the first one was that, again, biological development precedes learning. The stages of cognitive development to him are age-bound, which are determined by the biology of mental growth, which sets the age-appropriate approaches to learning. The next one, child's intellectual development occurs as a series of processes. So in effect, children, again, think in ways that are different from adults. And this is due to their biological development, and how they are taking place within the child. The third, the child's intellectual development also occurs through active interaction with the world. So there is an environmental component. We build up knowledge as children through the experiences of experimentation with the world. The fourth one, child assists their learning progress by being actively involved in the learning process. And this active involvement is incredibly important. It enables, and activity enables the child to build increasingly complex schema to understand the world and interact with it. So within the stages of Piaget's theory of cognitive development, there are 4 different ones, and I'm going to talk more about them in more detail in a second here. But the first one is sensorimotor stage, which takes place between birth and 2 years old. Then we have the pre-operational stage between 2 and 7 years old. Then we move into concrete operational, which is 7 to 11 years old. And the final stage takes us to the end of our life, and that is the formal operational stage. So with the sensory motor stage, this is where the baby goes from reflex and instinctive actions like rooting and sucking. I just saw my niece, and every time I see my niece, she started to suck on her thumb. So that's the sucking instinctive action that ends up occurring. And this allows us, as we develop in this stage, to construct a schema based on experience of how the world actually works. So we are just, we sort of come into the world based on these small experiences we may have had in the womb, but mostly on the basis of our biology and our reflexes. And so by this time the stage is complete, the child will have a sense of what is called object permanence. And object permanence is the idea that and understanding that objects still exist even when they are out of view. So for instance, young children end up becoming really entertained by peekaboo because they have not developed object permanence. They think that when you are hiding behind your 2 hands, that perhaps you're actually missing. And so, right around the age of 2, peekaboo suddenly becomes a lot less entertaining because they know that you're there. The next stage is the pre-operational stage. This is between ages 2 and 7, and this is a pretty important time in a child's life because there's a few different things that have to be learned and taught within this stage of life. And so this is where the child's thinking is limited by lacking the dimensions of conservation and unable to see a physical situation from the view of another person. And these are based on 2 different ideas, not only theory of mind, which we talked about with brain development, but also conservation, where an object or substance is perceived as remaining the same in quantity even when it's worked into another shape. And then also egocentrism. And this is when thinking of yourself only without consideration of others. And theory of mind sort of plays into this idea, right? Your development of theory of mind means that you can move away from this egocentric position. And if we think about it, a lot of the programming that's geared towards children of this age is about this very thing. So, this is our good old friend Barney from when we were little kids, but Barney is trying to talk about, sharing and all of these different ideas where we are trying to go away from egocentrism in this stage of development from 2 to 7. So this is a video I highly suggest looking at. It's going to go over conservation and the ability to see 2 things as being equal even if they are in different size containers. So I highly suggest looking at that on the PowerPoint version of this section of notes. So this takes us back into the study Piaget and Inhelder from 1956. And obviously Piaget is from our good buddy Jean Piaget and his co-researcher on this, Inhelder. So this was again to see whether children who are less than 7 years old are able to see the model of a mountain scene from their own viewpoint only. So they took children 4 to 8 who were presented with 3 paper mache mountains of various colors with something different on the top. They then walked around the model, explored it, and then sat on one side while a doll was placed on the other. And they were shown 10 pictures from different viewpoints of the model and told to select the picture representing the doll's view, right? So trying to show this theory of mind. So here again, we see the picture of the doll and the child. So the results were that the 4-year-olds often chose the picture matching their own views. 6-year-olds showed some understanding of other viewpoints, but often selected the wrong picture. However, the 7 to 8-year-olds, consistent with Piaget's study, often chose the picture, the correct picture of the doll's view, right? And so the conclusion was that 4-year-olds firmly in the pre-operational stage were unaware that there were viewpoints other than their own. However, children under 7 and children above 7 are suddenly starting to gain this sense that there are other viewpoints than your own. You're able to pick the position of someone else's position from that point. However, there was a few controversies, so to speak, or limitations of this study. And the first one was that since mountains were outside the experience of many, could the answers have been one of a lack of understanding of the task or the subject matter? And the idea that this is not necessarily an experiment where you're seeing true cause and effect, but rather a controlled observation that may have limited the scope of this particular study. And so taking on the the first limitation that we talked about there, Borke decided to replicate the same procedure but with a few modifications in 1975. The first one was that the content of the task was changed to make it more relatable to children. Grover became the doll, and the mountains were changed to farm areas with details such as people, trees, animals, lakes, and houses. And instead of picking one from a series of pictures, children were given 2 identical displays, one to look at, and then one that was on a turntable. And then they were asked to turn the table to select the angle that they believed that the doll Grover saw. Right? So in this study, though, children as young as 3 to 4 years old were able to turn the turntable, and to match Grover's viewpoint. And so the results of the original experiment may have been biased in that way, right? And even though Borke is not disputing the evidence or the existence of egocentrism, he's saying that it may happen earlier than the very firm age ranges that Piaget describes. So moving on from the pre-operational stage, we're going to look at the concrete operational stage, and this takes place between about the ages of 7 and 11 years old. So in this stage, the child will be able to look at objects from the point of view from others when prompted. So egocentrism declines in the concrete operational stage. They will also understand conservation, but they can only do so when the objects are present. So no abstract pictures. The next one is formal operational stage. So this is at ages 12 and up. So the thinking under this and the processes involving a combination of schemas can be carried out without the support of representing objects being physically present. So this is abstract pictures. As I very slowly write it so that it's clear enough to all of you. This is difficult without a stylus. So these work things out very logically without the support of concrete examples. So in the concrete operational stage, just for a second, a lot of the math problems that we see are oftentimes like addition and subtraction problems that are like, Johnny has 2 cookies and he eats 1 cookie. How many cookies does he have, right? Connecting math to like physical objects. But in the formal operational stage, we start to see, 1x plus 3x equals 7. What is x? We can start to think about abstract objects or things that are not there, right? So in this process, the child can start to think and reason as an adult. And so it really expands and brings adult-like thinking, even though there's still a developmental process and there's a continual growth that occurs from this. All right, so earlier on we talked about assimilation and accommodation. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail on this particular slide. So there are a few ways developmentally that our schemas develop in scope and in complexity. So the first one is assimilation. So using existing schema to deal with a new object or situation, leading to new info being integrated into the old existing schema, right? So for instance, 2-year-old Susie knows how to grip a rattle and make a noise. She finds a rubber hammer that makes a loud squeak when gripped, shaken, or squeezed, and these fit in with her pre-existing notion of the object. However, when the existing schema does not work in the new situation, and the schema needs to be modified to deal with it, it can lead to what is called disequilibrium. And this is a temporary frustration that is existing until the person can create a new schema. So this involves coming into contact with a new type of cup. How in effect do I end up using it? Now, when we get out of this frustration, when we have sort of overcome this frustration, we go back into what is called equilibrium. So this is where the existing schema becomes sufficiently modified and complex to deal with most situations. So for instance, a lot of you are either doing the full IB diploma or are taking IB classes for the first time, right? A lot of you probably went through a disequilibrium because a lot of the things and the concepts and the ways in which you are using your thinking are very different from what you have encountered in the past. And so in this way, you've come through disequilibrium. But a lot of times I'll notice that, even for the juniors that I have in class who are very frustrated a lot of the year in IB, they come into senior year and they seem to sort of find themselves and get used to the level of work that is being had. And so they go from disequilibrium to equilibrium. And we always need to challenge ourselves in order to continue to advance our learning. And that's what's going on with this. Now, the other type here is accommodation. And we talked about this type earlier. This is where the existing schemas have been developed to the level of complexity where the person can handle similar objects and situations without thought. And you have in effect changed the schemas that are there. Now, in terms of schema adaptation, just a little bit more, schema adaptation. Our learning ends up taking place when we are faced with situations that our schema cannot easily process and creating disequilibrium. In short ways, or in the short term, disequilibrium is frustrating, but in the long term, it's actually good for us. And so the learner ends up re-equalizing information and then forming new skills or information. Also, the process of bringing the schemas to the next level of complexity ends up requiring 2 elements. In that, the first one is that the child actually faces situations where existing simpler schemas would not work. And so more complex and creative play environments end up giving them giving us some of those skills. The second way is that the child is sufficiently physiologically developed with the capacities to modify the existing schemas, right? And so this is pointing back towards this idea that the biological structures must be in place in order for this learning to occur. If you don't have those biological structures in order to support this cognitive development, you are going to be very, very frustrated. That's why we often would not give like calculus problems to a kindergartner unless they're so off the chart. But under Piaget's view, this just would not happen. Because again, development in the eyes of Piaget comes before learning. Now, a few applications of Piaget. This has been used widely within learning and educational practice. This includes the idea that learning should be a process of active discovery. The findings should create initial disequilibrium that moves into equilibrium. You should be taught concepts and tasks that are compatible with the stage of the child's biological maturation and not beyond it. And then the teacher's role is to create a physical and social environment that facilitates learning. Now, a few strengths and limitations of Piaget. The first, under the strengths column, is that it demonstrated that children of different age groups and process information very differently. They do not process them in the same way as adults. They also place the emphasis on the teacher as facilitator rather than dispenser of knowledge, allowing the child to show active discovery. And this is especially true for younger grades. And then the third one, it is the basis for a great deal of critical research. And this has vastly increased understanding of cognitive development. Now, as far as limitations go, Piaget's methods using observation, scenario exercises, and interviews are not necessarily showing causation. And they also used very small samples that did not represent general population. Also, the child development may be seen as a continuous process rather than the steps that Piaget describes. Also, the research methods placed too much emphasis on deducing conclusions from participants' mistakes, which could lead to illusory correlation or causation. And then also other researchers claim that it is possible to speed up cognitive development given suitable support. And we're going to look at that when we talk about Vygotsky in the next video. All right, so if you have any questions, please by all means contact me. Again, I hope all of you have a great day.